So I think we're going to get started here. Good afternoon and welcome to Blueprint for Clean Energy, a webinar speaker series hosted by the Yale Center for Business and the Environment. My name is Corey Yamada and I will be your host for today's webinar on climate finance. The Blueprint for Clean Energy webinar series invites leading practitioners and researchers in the field of clean energy to talk about the latest opportunities and developments in corporate, nonprofit, and public-private arenas. Joining us today from Climate Policy Initiative is Jane Chu, Bella Tonkonogy, and Cooper Wetherbee. Jane, Bella, and Cooper will share an overview of CPI's projects to improve energy and land use policies around the world through CPI's Global Landscape of Climate Finance and Climate Finance Lab. Jane, Bella, and Cooper, it is a pleasure to have you join us today. We are excited to hear your presentation. We would like to remind our listeners that we welcome any questions you have and will direct them to our speakers at the end of the talk. Please type your questions directly into the Q&A window at any time during the presentation. And with that, I would like to hand it over to CPI to begin the presentation.
Great, thank you so much, Corey, and the Yale Center for Business and Environment for inviting us to speak with you today and to present our work on climate finance. So next slide, just so you know who you'll be speaking with today. I'm Bella Tonkonogy. I'm Associate Director in CPI's San Francisco office. I have oversight over the Global Innovation Lab for Climate Finance, which we'll talk about today, as well as some of the work that we do in cities and cities finance. I've been also for a long time working in the area of international and domestic climate finance and economics. Really excited to share with you all today our experience in this topic. Over to you, Cooper.
Thanks, Bella. Hello, everyone. My name is Cooper Wetherbee. I'm an analyst with CPI's San Francisco office. I work on climate finance tracking, including our flagship Global Landscape report, as well as some other analytical outputs. I also support the development of innovative financial instruments through the Climate Finance Lab. Two of those currently on my plate are the Green FDIC, which is a Brazilian debt instrument to finance rooftop solar at scale, and Green Street Africa, which uses local currency bonds to prepare and develop off-grid energy access solutions for public schools in Nigeria. Before CPI, I worked in power markets and distributed energy resources consulting at a firm called ICF. Now I'll pass it on to you, Jane.
Great. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. My name is Jane Chu. I'm a senior analyst based in CPI San Francisco office as well. My current work involves serving on the Secretariat of the City's Climate Finance Leadership Alliance, which is a UN entity that is the only multi-level and multi-stakeholder coalition aimed at closing the investment gap for subnational urban infrastructure projects around the world. I'm also the CPI Cities lead for the Global Innovation Lab for Climate Finance, and we'll discuss that later in this presentation. Prior to CPI, I worked in global environmental justice and eco-city planning and design on both coasts of the United States and in Asia. I'm also a recent 2019 grad of the joint degree program between Yale FES and Yale SOM. So I'm super pumped to be back here and speaking with you all again. And my email is going to be at the end of this webinar if any of you want to chat more about working in climate finance after graduation.
Great, thank you so much. So again, thanks to everybody for listening today. We are going to go ahead and turn off our videos now for the remainder of the slide presentation, and then we'll turn them back on when we get to Q&A at the end. Our idea is that we'll spend about 35 minutes, give or take, on the presentation and leave plenty of time for Q&A at the end. So please, as Corey mentioned, do feel free to type in your questions into the chat box. So on the agenda for today, I'll give a brief overview about Climate Policy Initiative so you understand a little bit more about our work. Cooper will then talk about what is climate finance and how we track it. Jane will talk about the lab that we've both just mentioned, or we've all just mentioned, and the way we're developing solutions to address gaps in climate finance globally. And finally, we'll end off on where we see this field going and hopefully give you all some ideas for future job and research opportunities. And as I mentioned, we'll leave plenty of time at the end for Q&A. So a little bit about CPI. So next slide, thank you. We are analysts and advisors with deep expertise in policy and finance, and our mission is to help governments, businesses, and financial institutions drive economic growth while addressing climate change. And we do this through our unique focus on finance, our ability to get the right people to the table, and our analytical rigor. And we are a global organization. We're based here in San Francisco, which is where the three of us are, but we're quite distributed and decentralized with approximately equal numbers of staff in our offices in London, in Jakarta, in Delhi, in Rio, and we have one person in Kenya as well, in Nairobi. Our approximately 80 staff have varying backgrounds. We're economists, MBAs, public policy professionals, lawyers, communications professionals, and graphic designers. And the three of us work, next slide please. The three of us work in CPI's largest division, which is focused on climate finance, and we have three areas of work. So the first is on the state of finance. So here we seek to understand investors and investment trends going towards climate change mitigation and adaptation projects globally. The second is on effective finance. And here we're seeking to accelerate the effective use of public and private resources, really trying to understand how, in particular, to better deploy public finance and policy towards mobilizing investment in climate solutions. And then finally, we use the knowledge from these two work areas to actively work in collaboration with many partners to develop and scale transformative solutions. So let me now turn it over to Cooper to go through how we define and track climate finance.
Great, thanks, Bella. So before we break down the global landscape of climate finance, let's first understand what this term climate finance means. Different organizations may be pushing slightly different definitions. For the sake of consistency, CPI uses the UNFCCC definition. So here we have mitigation finance, which is about addressing greenhouse gas emissions and sinks, and adaptation finance, which is about reducing vulnerability to climate change impacts, heat waves, droughts, rising seas, etc. And then a third category that we track is called dual benefits finance. And that's just tracking of finance for projects that have characteristics of both mitigation and adaptation finance. Next slide, please. Okay, so what is the landscape? The landscape is, to be brief, the most comprehensive assessment available of global climate finance. It's a tool for policymakers far and wide, and it covers 6 years of data from 2013 to 2018. The information that the landscape provides is used by policymakers in the public sector, multilateral institutions in the private sector. We've listed UNFCCC here, IPCC, but we also hope that it's increasingly useful to private fund managers, corporations, financial institutions to drive their investment decision making. Okay, in terms of what we're tracking, we track annual climate finance commitments into new activities that meet those mitigation and adaptation definitions. Specifically, we're looking at primary financial transactions and investment costs. What we're not tracking is all this stuff that you see on the right. Risk mitigation instruments, policy-driven, revenue support or subsidies, secondary market transactions where things are changing hands, and then some sectors that's difficult to distinguish green investment from non-green investment. So manufacturing, sales, research and development investment. And then fossil fuel-based emissions reduction and energy efficiency investments are also a no-no, because that's essentially perpetuating the prolonged stay of high carbon assets in the energy system, and that's not really aligned with climate goals. So basically, anything where money isn't changing hands at the time of the transaction, like insurance and guarantees, those risk mitigation instruments, as well as sectors that either aren't aligned with climate goals or where we aren't able to distinguish between climate and non-climate related investment. Moving on, how do we track climate finance? There is a lot on this slide, and I encourage you to come back and review it in greater detail when you have a second. For now, though, I'll just mention that our process uses 11 different transaction data sets, ranging from the more well-known that you may have heard of, like Bloomberg New Energy Finance's renewables transaction data set, all the way down to much smaller custom data sets that we construct ourselves based on confidential survey data received from development finance institutions like the World Bank. We clean and merge those data sets into one master database, which contains information from the source of finance to the type of financial instrument, all the way to the activity and use of that finance at the project level. So here you see a breakdown of that in each one of these boxes of the table. And then moving on, in our Sankey diagram, we can really visualize these flows. So for example, we can compare under the sources and intermediaries category how much finance is flowing broadly from public versus private sources, and then break it down even within private sources, and we can see that corporate actors are a much larger influence on private finance than commercial financial institutions, and then track that as it flows through to instruments, uses, and sectors where we see renewable energy generation accounting for almost half of all climate finance, followed by low carbon transport as the next biggest sector. So this is one of the most important visual outputs from the landscape. This graphic shows up a lot in our work because it's a very useful visual to quickly convey the relationships between these different attributes of climate finance transactions. Next slide, please. Okay, so there is plenty to unpack in a report as comprehensive as the 2019 landscape, but the headlines here really are climate finance averaged $579 billion annually in the 2017-18 period. That's the first time we've seen that number eclipse the $500 billion mark. Public and private finance commitments continue to rise across all sectors, so that is some good news. The vast majority of investment that we see, 93%, goes to mitigation projects. Those could be renewable energy, energy efficiency, transport, etc. However, we've seen strong growth in adaptation and dual benefits finance as well. Funding for adaptation increased 35% from the previous cycle, which was tracking data from 2015 and 2016, to an average of $30 billion a year in 2017-18. However, we still need to stress the importance of adaptation and resilience investment in the future to continue that growing that number, because it does still compose a small portion of overall climate finance. Renewable energy specifically accounts for more than 4/5 of private climate finance. And that's because renewable energy projects tend to be bankable, meaning they can attract large-scale investment. But there's a clear need to drive more private investment in some other critical mitigation areas: energy efficiency, transport, land use, agriculture being some of the big priorities there. The majority of climate finance continues to flow to developing countries, which is a positive for meeting the UN Sustainable Development Goals. It's important that we make equity a central concern in financing the transition to a low carbon and climate resilient economy. So that's a promising trend that we hope to see continue. And then finally here, about 3/4 of all climate finance that we track is raised and spent without crossing international borders. And that really underlines the need for effective national policies. Investors like to play in their own backyards. They like to invest where they have a better grasp of market dynamics, investment opportunities, and risk profiles of various types of climate investments. And so in order to encourage a scale up in climate finance, national policy is a huge influence in that, really building a strong enabling environment. Next slide, please. Okay, so this slide presents what's probably the biggest takeaway from the 2019 landscape report, which is that we do see increasing climate finance commitments in the 6-year trajectory that we have illustrated here with biennial averages. but we're still falling far short of the level of climate investment that's required to keep global temperature rise to a 1.5 degrees C scenario. So on the left, we see the increase in climate finance over time as tracked by the landscape. On the right, we see those climate finance figures, which are the blue line towards the bottom of the graph. And they're dwarfed by climate investment needs, which is in the green range. That need is actually just the need identified by IPCC for the energy sector transition, and it's estimated at $1.6 to $3.8 trillion per year. So the big message here is we need a paradigm shift in our approach in order to scale up climate finance rapidly and fill that gap. Moving on. And finally, in the 2019 landscape report, we've provided 6 broad recommendations for a variety of audiences to boost global growth of climate finance. The first recommendation is directed at governments who should continue to raise the level of ambition in national climate plans and allocate resources to enable the implementation of these plans. So I mentioned this, but it's especially given the domestic focus of much of overall climate investment that we've tracked. It's very important that governments do all they can to encourage that type of investment within their own borders. Secondly, public and private actors must coordinate to rapidly scale up finance in land use, transport, and other sectors outside of renewable energy. So again, we're seeing a lot of private sector interest in renewable energy. And that is good insofar as sustainable assets are being built, energy systems across the globe are getting cleaner. But there's a real need to now apply that same approach to growing climate finance to other sectors that don't seem as attractive to private investment at the moment. Next up, all financial actors should seek full alignment with the Paris Agreement across all of their operations. So this is the difference between treating climate finance or green finance and investment as one silo within your organization versus actually broadening that policy to encompass all of the decisions that you're making in terms of financing, in terms of the activities that your financial institution is undertaking, and making sure that each of those activities is aligned with the targets of the Paris Agreement. When we talk about alignment, a big component in addition to increasing climate finance is also decreasing finance for harmful activities, carbon-intensive investments in mining, fossil fuel extraction, fossil fuel energy generation, etc. Fourth recommendation is that capital markets and banking must shift toward green finance. Commercial financial institutions still make up a relatively small portion of private climate finance compared to corporates who are investing essentially in provision of energy for their own facilities. And so there's a huge capacity in the financial sector to be a positive influence in growing climate finance, and we're looking forward to helping them continue to grow into that role as we try to scale up climate finance in the coming years. Our fifth point here is that public institutions particularly have to make every dollar count and ensure that their investments in climate finance and in bringing private investment into the sector are high quality. So that's an especially important point because public resources are limited. And in the context, for example, of coronavirus and state resources being deployed for economic stimulus and policymakers having perhaps a shorter attention span than they would normally, it's especially important to make sure that when we do get those scarce resources deployed towards climate finance, that they're being utilized as effectively as possible to drive the change that we want to see. And then the last recommendation is really a blanket recommendation for those of us in the climate finance tracking space. So as the landscape of climate finance continues to evolve, as we see growth in certain sectors and slack in other sectors, we'll need to further anticipate, adapt to, and promote those types of changes to facilitate a rapid transition to a low carbon, climate resilient economy. And that means developing new data sources, networking more effectively with our partners in the space, and then also coming up with new analytical methodologies in order to be able to more effectively analyze the current landscape of climate finance and then predict and dictate where it's going. And with that, Jane, I will pass it off to you.
Great, thanks, Cooper. So as Cooper just showed, we are currently facing a climate finance gap in the trillions of dollars range. So it's really critical to unlock substantially more sustainable investment to stay below the 1.5 and 2 degrees C temperature growth scenarios that we need to avoid catastrophic change to the planet. This is in line with Paris Agreement goals to drastically reduce emissions around the world in our lifetimes. And this also supports the Global Sustainable Development Goals by the United Nations, because sustainable investments can improve what and how we consume, how we relate to each other, and overall public health. To that end, of ramping up sustainable investments, CPI serves as secretariat to the Global Innovation Lab for Climate Finance, which brings together over 60 institutions to brainstorm and pilot new ideas which attempt to fill the global finance gap. As you can see from this slide, the lab is supported by various country governments as well as large philanthropies, and the lab's membership includes banks, development finance institutions, and other stakeholders from the sustainable investing universe. The lab functions on a model that's geared toward identifying, developing, and launching innovative finance instruments with the goal of generating billions of dollars in private investment toward action on climate change and on sustainable development overall. To date, we've launched 41 such innovative climate finance instruments and brought over 300 experts from both the developed and developing contexts around the table to discuss how to jointly address the climate finance gap. So what is a financial instrument in the context of the lab? The lab's overarching goal is to crowd in private financing for climate-related projects. So we look for financial tools that facilitate transactions, mobilize investments, and provide financial services. Some previous types of instruments we've seen come through the lab over the years include various types of funds, bonds, structured equity vehicles, insurance products, guarantees, lending platforms, paper service models, and securitization structures. And those are just a few examples. Later on in this webinar, we're going to present a more detailed example of how a lab instrument works and how we support the development of that instrument through the lab process. You can also visit climatefinancelab.org to read more details about all our endorsed lab instruments to date. In order to maximize impact, the lab's instrument selection process emphasizes those sectors most critical to successful action on climate change. This includes work on renewable energy, energy efficiency, cities transportation, water conservation, land use, sustainable agriculture, like supporting smallholders in developing countries, any work on climate risk, and last but not least, issues around energy access and energy equity. The lab's work spans multiple countries and regions around the world with a focus on developing countries in Asia, Latin America, and Africa. And I'll talk more about this global approach in the next slide. One thing to note about the lab is that there's not just one lab. The global lab was the first innovation lab for climate finance established in 2014. It accepts submissions of climate finance ideas from around the world, as its name would suggest. In 2015, we established the India Lab, which focuses on India-specific climate finance instruments. And then this was closely followed in 2016 by establishment of the Brazil Lab, which focuses on climate finance instruments for the Brazil context. And finally, in this most recent 2020 cycle, we kicked off a lab for Southern Africa as well. These regional labs really help ensure that good ideas from around the world are evaluated by local experts who understand local contexts. A little more detail on how the lab works in practice. The lab has an annual cycle which runs from September to September of each year. It starts with a call for ideas, and that call concludes around the winter holiday season. In January, CPI narrows the submissions of ideas down into a short list, and then we send those ideas on to lab members to review during their February meeting. The ideas that they select from their meeting go through a rigorous 7-month development process where the lab's analysts, experts, and working group partners fine-tune the idea mechanics to be more market ready. And finally, the following September after that, lab members vote on whether the ideas are truly implementable, and they officially endorse or give their seal approval to those that are ready to be piloted. The lab follows 4 criteria that the instruments must meet in order to be selected. And we also look to these 4 criteria through every step of the stress testing and development process that I mentioned that lead up to the endorsement. The first criteria is actionability, which means that lab ideas should identify who will implement the idea and give a clear pathway to implementation, including a defined time frame, key activities, and project milestones. The actionability criteria also requires that some sort of understanding of potential challenges to implementation exists, as well as strategies to overcome those implementation challenges. And then the next criteria is innovation. This is the innovation lab. So lab ideas need to demonstrate how this idea addresses a climate finance barrier or barriers that's either not yet addressed on the market or that can be addressed more impactfully if the idea is implemented. Our third criteria is catalytic potential, which is the ability of the idea to mobilize private sources of climate finance within a large market. This includes how likely that idea is to scale up, as well as the potential for replication of that idea in other markets. So for this criteria, we look closely at the idea's ability to deliver measurable socioeconomic development and climate impacts. Finally, the fourth criteria of the lab is financial sustainability. High quality lab ideas will have a clear pathway to phasing out public financial support over time so that they can achieve commercial viability. Our most recent call for ideas in 2020, which concluded at the end of 2019, received in total 195 idea submissions. And during that 11-week period where the call was open, we logged over 18,000 visits to the submission website. 520 new users signed up, and we saw traffic from 163 countries, especially developing countries. And all this to show that there's not just wide and immense interest in participating in the lab, but there's also a level of interest that is truly global as well. Because the goal of the lab is to close the global climate finance gap, a key metric that we use to gauge success is how much climate finance and sustainable investments we were able to mobilize through the lab process. So far, we've seen over $2 billion mobilized across the 41 instruments, which is 200 times what funders of the lab invested into the lab process. And 370 million of that total mobilization was contributed by lab members, while 1.7 billion was catalyzed in additional investments. And how do we track mobilization? So we track climate finance mobilized of the lab by 3 different categories. First is the investment in the initial implementation of the idea once it is endorsed by lab members. Second, we follow the co-investments and track leverage that is unlocked by those initial investments. And finally, we track investments that occur as a result of ongoing scaling up and replication of the idea after it has been piloted and proven. Finally, we also track how much private finance the lab instruments mobilized through the lab process. So far, $800 million has been mobilized as a result of private investor activity in the lab, and over 90% of that is from institutional investors and commercial banks. So how does that all work in practice? I'll hand it off next to my colleague Bella to give an example of a specific lab instrument, as well as provide additional overview of CPI's other work.
Great, thanks so much, Jane. So we thought an example might be helpful to all of you to understand a little bit more concretely what we're talking about in the lab. So just a couple of years ago, I worked on an idea brought to the lab by a consortium that included Baker and McKenzie, a global law firm, and a boutique consulting firm called Get to See. And so let me just give you a little bit of a flavor of how we worked with them. So on this slide, what you see is some of the work that we did to identify the barriers in the market and the innovation of the instrument. And then after the slide, I'll explain to you a little bit more what the instrument does. But what, the idea that was brought to us was really addressing a prevalent gap in the market for renewable energy in developing countries. And that is that there is a lack of early stage risk capital for project development. And basically the model for renewable energy project development, especially in more challenging policy and enabling environment contexts, like in many developing countries, it's not that different from venture capital. Of 10 projects you might start, maybe 2 to 3 actually make it to financial close and then construction. And that process itself can take anywhere from 1 to 5 years. And there are all sorts of regulatory risks, things like permitting, site acquisition, utility connections, environmental and social impacts. And most developers can't easily manage this risk unless they have large balance sheets. And most investors don't want to invest in these types of projects at this stage, even though there are many investors out there who would be interested in investing once they get to financial close, and many more, especially sort of the lowest risk tolerant ones like institutional investors, once the projects actually get to operation. And to date, a lot of the way that these types of early stage risk or early stage capital needs have been met in emerging markets is through grants, which are extremely limited. So in the first few months of the lab incubation process, what we did is we conducted interviews with market experts, confirmed many of these barriers, and we looked at other ways that these barriers have been solved. And essentially worked on making the case for why a new solution was needed and why this particular solution would be effective. So on the next slide, what you can see is what the solution that was proposed and that we helped develop looked like. So their idea that they brought to us was for an options platform to drive private institutional equity into earlier stages of renewable energy projects. And the way it worked is that they proposed to create a fund that would buy options in early stage projects. For those of you who are maybe not in business school, just an option essentially means it's a opportunity, or it literally gives them the option to buy shares at financial close. So this fund would give small amounts of money to many projects to help them with their concrete next steps. So for example, for pre-feasibility or feasibility studies or environmental social impact, or to get through the permitting process, in exchange for options to purchase shares at financial close. And then as the developer hit its milestones, the fund would invest further money in exchange for additional options. And then at financial close, the options could be exercised or sold to another investor. And so for any of you who are familiar with how venture capital works, it's kind of the same idea. You might only get 2 out of 10 projects hitting financial close, but then those would support the rest of them. So once we understood better the mechanics, we developed a much more detailed financial model. We helped make connections with potential funders. in particular, funders to get this off the ground. We identified markets where this or where an idea like this could both meet real need and have a greater likelihood of success. So looking at factors like the business environment, renewable energy policies, among others. And then, as Jane mentioned, the idea was then endorsed at an annual high-level lab event where we bring together all of the financial institutions, both public and private, that are members of the lab. And now the idea is nearing implementation in Southeast Asia. And I think what we've also seen is because the lab process is essentially an open process, so all of this information is publicly available. We are already seeing this type of model being taken up in other funds, and also starting to see grant funders start to incorporate these types of ideas into their own project preparation facilities. So on the next slide, I'll just say very briefly what we're doing this year in the lab. So we're working now on 8 new ideas, 4 that are global but sectorally focused. So one in nature-based solutions, 1 in sustainable agriculture, 1 in sustainable energy access, and a 4th in sustainable cities. And then we're working on 4 ideas that are region-specific and working with local stakeholders and local lab members. So 1 in India, 2 in Brazil, and 1 in Southern Africa. So now if you move just to the next slide. So we just wanted to end this presentation and this discussion with some thoughts on what the future could hold for climate finance, and in particular where CPI is focusing our efforts. So in the middle of this graphic, you can see where we are today, which is, as Cooper mentioned, we're at $579 billion of annual climate finance flows. But as we mentioned, the needs are far greater. So some of where we're headed in this is in the hexagon surrounding that center one. So let me just start at the top and go clockwise. So our first focus is on improving tracking. So not only filling in the data gaps, of which there are some, especially in the harder sectors like adaptation, but also in connecting this tracking the impact and the goals of the Paris Agreement. So what effect are flows having on emissions and on resilience, and how do clean flows compare to fossil intensive flows, which we currently do not track? As a corollary to this, we're also looking upstream at what is facilitating or preventing flows, especially as it relates to how institutions can change how they're operating and how they make decisions. So that's investment decision-making criteria, their governance, the strategies, to help increase the effectiveness of climate finance and reduce their risks. And the term you hear a lot and that Cooper mentioned about this topic, it's called Paris alignment. So aligning or making financial flows consistent with the goals of the Paris Agreement, and what are the institutional changes needed to get us there. So then moving on to the next hexagon about scaling blended finance. So for the lab and with the lab, we're wondering what's the next step to get beyond innovation and through to scale. So how can we better support instruments after their first implementations? We're starting to see some of the earliest instruments, the ones that we developed in 2014 and 2015, already have successful pilots. So what can we do and what can others do to better support them after those first implementations? And more broadly, even beyond the lab, what's needed to transform systems so that climate finance just becomes finance? We're also expanding our work in cities and other critical but challenging sectors. So cities are 70% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and yet they have major challenges in preparing and financing climate compatible infrastructure. And so one of the things we're doing is we manage an initiative called the Cities Climate Finance Leadership Alliance, which seeks to address this gap and really bring together stakeholders in cities climate finance to be the main platform to working together to address this gap. Next, we are doubling down on the major economies. So we opened our offices in India, Brazil, and Indonesia almost a decade ago because they are some of the key geographies for combating climate change. And we work very closely with the governments and financial institutions that are based there. We're also expanding our work in China with a project to scope an expansion of our lab there this year. And finally, it might go without saying, but we are, of course, taking a fresh look at all our work in the context of the current COVID-19 crisis and the implications of it on the economy and on climate change. We believe that sustainable, inclusive, and resilient development will be more necessary than ever in the coming years, and are actively working on ideas for action, especially in how public finance can best be utilized as stimulus for a greener, more resilient future. So with that, let me close the panel part of this webinar. You see here on the slide links to the websites of some of first of CPI, but then also of the initiatives that we discussed today. Please feel free to email Jane, your fellow Yale grad, with general inquiries. And I just want to mention as well that we do have, we are continuing forward with plans to have summer interns this summer, and we do have an opening up on our website. So if you're interested in coming to work with us for the summer, I definitely encourage you to apply. So thanks again, and I don't know if Corey, if you want to jump in here, if we should just go straight to Q&A.
Definitely, I'll jump into the Q&A now, and just want to thank you guys for the presentation. And again, remind our listeners that if you have questions, please direct them to the question and answer panel on Zoom. So we already actually received a few questions from the audience, so maybe just going in order. Matthew asked, what are your thoughts on green transition bonds from animal and crop agricultural organizations who are generally using these bonds for creating efficiencies? Since animal protein and nitrogen use are major contributors to greenhouse gases, are these essentially the same as emissions from fossil fuel projects, which you say you don't consider from climate finance?
I think I could take this one. I actually got about 3/4 of the way through typing a response, but I'm happy to elaborate. So that's a great question, Matthew. We're aware of several issues in the green bond space regarding definitions and specifically whether quote unquote green bonds are actually effective in driving climate positive outcomes. As part of our landscape methodology, we vet green bonds independently since top-down taxonomies to define what is and what isn't green or climate related are still developing and not necessarily applied universally, even when we look at sovereign bond issues. With respect to the similarity between fossil fuel energy efficiency and agricultural efficiency, that's an excellent point. Really at this point, it's looking at low-hanging fruit, and it's really a viable goal and part of the policy conversation among many national governments and internationally to be replacing fossil fuel infrastructure with renewable energy. Certainly, if we were to think about a drawdown of use of animal, cultivation of animals as food, there would be a much greater conversation that would need to happen there, I think, at the policy level with respect to, well, okay, are we going to make people go on a vegetarian or vegan diet worldwide? And that seems like an issue that gets addressed later on down the pipe, as opposed to something that's a little bit more obvious and immediate and large scale, like the energy sector. But certainly the similarities are there, and it basically just comes down to what we think is achievable.
Okay, awesome. Thanks for answering that, Cooper. Another question that Matthew had was, when speaking with colleagues at major investment banks on investing in non-renewable energy projects, I've heard that essentially the juice isn't worth the squeeze. What organizations or high net worth individuals may be more interested in taking higher risk for projects that have less ROI or are less accurate or have less accuracy in measuring mitigation?
Yeah, this is Bella. I'm happy to take that one, and I guess I can start my video too. So yeah, thanks for this question. So a couple of thoughts on this, and yes, undoubtedly, these types of projects and land use projects in particular can be can be quite challenging. Actually, in addition to the renewable energy scale-up facility instrument that I worked on a couple of years ago, I've also worked on a land use one called the Smallholder Forestry Vehicle in Kenya, which was about aggregating up microforestry investments in coastal Kenya by a company called Kamaza, and extremely challenging, right? I think what the kinds of investors that we were seeing there that could be interesting, I think you have to think a little bit more creatively and broad. So we're actually starting to see a couple of multinational corporations making some of these investments. So for example, companies with wood in their supply chain are interested in supporting both projects that sort of lessen deforestation, but also allow them to source sustainable products for their own businesses. So Kamaza's model is basically trying to support smallholder forestry, small micro plantations to reduce pressure on deforestation in particular. In Brazil, our Brazil office has just released this month a paper called The Impacts of Rural Credit on Agricultural Outcomes and Land Use. And it's actually looking at Brazil's rural credit policy and as the title implies, and its impacts on agricultural production, land use, and deforestation. And it found that credit for small farmers leads to greater increases in agricultural productivity, more efficient land use, and reduced deforestation. And so the types of banks that are already investing and providing credit to agriculture, to rural and smallholder and small farmers, with sort of tweaks to how they do business, can actually support some of the increases in productivity that again lessen the pressure on deforestation or on forests themselves.
Bella, maybe just to follow up a little bit on that, another person had a question regarding the Brazil lab currently, and you were talking a little bit about that. But given the political climate with the current president in place, has the Brazil lab seen like additional challenges when trying to establish these instruments and push climate finance?
Yes, for sure. I mean, I think that's certainly a concern anywhere, and especially as with politics and as policies change, the types of instruments that will succeed or can change. I think a lot of our work is focused on, I mean, in the lab especially, what we try to do is find and to seek out instruments that aren't so dependent on policy, or for example, don't need new policy in order to be implemented. And so in the lab, I think we've probably seen a little bit less of the implications on it. Although you do, you have policy change, you do see policy changes. So one of the instruments that we're working on is seeing some policy changes, I think, with net metering, and maybe Cooper, you might know a little bit more about this specifically, but just with like a net metering policy, and then how that then affects the economics of that instrument specifically. So we're seeing a little bit, there's policy change happening everywhere, and where it's a fact of life, I think, for climate, no matter what. And so what we try to do is work within the policies that exist, and also work to showcase the effectiveness of, and to really be sort of a neutral voice in demonstrating the effectiveness of sort of the, especially in the win-win, say, of good policy in this area. Cooper, do you have anything to add specifically, or are you?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, so I'd say generally there is a lot of discussion around net metering policy, around interconnection tariffs. There's movement forwards on that. There's movement backwards on that. There's certainly a lot of very powerful lobbies, both on the utility side and on the solar industry side, that we see kind of fighting this tug of war over how distributed resources that are plugging into the grid should be compensated. And so specifically in Brazil, one thing that's been interesting to work on recently is this green FDIC instrument with which I'm involved, which basically securitizes investments in individual rooftop solar projects to bundle them and make them safer for institutional investors to dip their toe into that market. One thing that we've seen is under the Bolsonaro administration, there's been a real reconsidering of what the value of behind the meter resources actually is. And so there are a lot of competing methodologies to understand specifically when you put a behind the meter resource onto the grid, is it being fairly compensated for the value it provides when it also may be imposing additional costs onto the energy system by needing reserve capacity because it's not producing energy at all times of the day, by injecting generation back into the system at times where that may not be safe for the system. And so even though you may be paid a certain price through the retail net metering costs that you're being assessed for generation injected back into the system, there are actually additional costs you're imposing onto the transmission and distribution system by operating that system. And so there is an effort underway in the Brazilian energy regulator, ANEL, to try to define those costs, and they're defining them a little bit more aggressively than they had in the past. So what that means for my work on the Green FDIC instrument is the initial proposal was to securitize rooftop solar loans, because we foresee regulation coming from ANEL very soon that's going to charge a grid access fee to behind the meter solar owners. We've actually pivoted that business model to now reflect a community solar approach that is front of the meter. And so there, I think the lesson there is the policy environment is constantly changing. One of the nice things about our work in finance is that we work with a lot of proponents in the lab and a lot of national governments and development finance institutions who are very creative about being able to structure these programs in a way that is adaptable to multiple policy contexts, multiple market paradigms, by aligning incentives such that we're really encouraging private investment, regardless of whether the country in which we're operating is particularly friendly to those types of climate smart investments, or maybe a little bit more hesitant to embrace them.
Awesome. Yeah, I think it's always really interesting to see the interplay between, with regulation. And so it's good to hear about, some of the things that CPI is working on to, get ahead of that and make sure it's resilient to those policy changes. Another question that someone had asked, switching gears here, is when you talk about public finance leveraging private finance, it has been seen that some countries accrue more compared to other countries. CPI's 2018 Blended Finance Report also ranked countries in terms of private sector attractiveness and identified 8 countries that can deliver the highest impact per dollar invested, both in improving the quality of energy access and delivering climate impact. What are CPI's recommendations to improve attractiveness in remaining countries to prevent reinforcing the Matthew effect when it comes to climate finance?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to take this one. So I was one of the authors on that report, and thank you for reading it and asking a very good question about it. So that paper did rank countries looking at 2 factors. So one was the potential for addressing energy access and climate change jointly, and then what the private sector business environment was in that country. And the goals for that report specifically were trying to understand one where you could have more impact with blended climate finance, and second, where it would be most likely to be effective. So those top 10 countries scored highly on both fronts. They were countries that were perhaps sort of obvious, some like India and South Africa, which are large markets with a lot of coal plans. Then some smaller markets like Mongolia that also has a lot of plans for coal development. And so you could potentially get much higher impact for your marginal dollar of blended finance. And then there were countries as well with very low levels of energy access, in particular in East Africa, but who have generally more stable business environments than comparable countries. So, in terms of, for this exercise, in terms of improving your score, certainly you don't want to make the climate problem worse. So I wouldn't go in that direction. But I think for a lot of countries, it's really about the enabling environment and making it easier to have to start a company or to start a business, reducing red tapes, the kinds of things that are found in the World Bank's annual, what is that report called? It's basically a ranking of countries in their business environments. So, so I think for that specific paper, that was the objective, and that is specifically looking at blended finance, which is, again, attempting to mobilize private investment. In terms of, where does your climate change dollar go furthest? Generally, I mean, I think that that really depends on what your focus is, and a lot of the work we do on effectiveness is trying to work through, in particular, with foundations and governments and development finance institutions, given their priorities, especially given their development priorities, sort of how can they best align their development priorities with climate change? So how can they most effectively use their dollars to achieve both goals? So some funders will have climate change as their top priority, and a lot of the investment that we recommend is looking at the countries with the highest emissions, or both in energy and land use, and those are often actually different countries. Some will be more focused on energy access, so we'll kind of look at ways to target both energy access and climate change. Let me pause there. I know we're actually almost out of time, so let me just see if there are other questions you want us to answer.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, we're almost out of time, so maybe just one more. You mentioned, making the most out of a dollar that is invested and trying to maximize that. And so as we were looking at the Sankey chart, I believe it was called, there was, a large portion of that was invested in renewable energy, but, mentioning the fact that we need to push climate finance towards a number of different areas, not just renewable energy. And so recognizing that, is there a particular area that you can identify that you think is most overlooked at this time and maybe could benefit most from additional finance?
Yeah, I mean, I think the International Energy Agency has a dashboard of where sort of what is on trend or on target for meeting our 2050 targets and what isn't. And basically the only thing that is large scale renewable energy, and things like buildings, transport, agriculture, land use, those sectors are all cities. They're all harder and require far more attention today. So I would say, looking at the dashboard, trying to understand what's falling behind will really help then to target climate finance, especially sort of some of the more public finance and philanthropic finance going forward. And then I would say sort of outside of the realm of mitigation, then adaptation is also adaptation and resilience finance. So helping communities, cities, countries deal with the impacts of climate change is also still far behind where it's needed.
Okay, awesome. So I think this will wrap up the Q&A session at this time. We actually had a number more questions that we received, but just because of time concerns, I think we'll close it off here. And so with that, this does conclude today's talk with CPI on climate finance. Jane, Bella, and Cooper, again, I'd like to thank you for joining us today and for their presentation. We also want to thank the Blueprint audience for participating and engaging with all the good questions that came in. And then just a final announcement, to view a recording of this webinar, please visit the events tab on the Yale Center for Business and the Environment website, or access the recording through CBA's YouTube page. So this will conclude the webinar, and thanks again for joining us.